The NFL schedule is here at last. I've ditched my backwards hat for some blue light glasses because it's time to nerd out about this schedule and what it means for the best ball playoffs. Welcome to The Climb. Yes, it's finally here. The schedule in full. You can see here there's already a lot of hype about the Chiefs and Bengals. We've also got Vikings, Packers. We'll talk through it all and how to use it for your best ball teams to give yourself a better chance when you're playing on Underdog. We've mentioned the schedule stuff before on the show, and we're certainly going to mention it a lot over the course of the rest of the summer. So I wanted to kind of talk through why we care about it specifically for Underdog. And so this is just showing the playoff structure of the two contests that are open currently. We've got Best Ball Mania 4 on the left and the Puppy on the right. And the key here is that these are basically 3 weeks of uncorrelated tournaments. So what happens in week 15 has no impact on what happens in week 16 and so on. And you're facing a really low odds of advancing. So basically, you have to try to find ways to give yourself an edge, increase your chances of getting to the finals. And when you do get to the finals, there's going to have been a natural consolidation towards the players that have had big games over the last couple playoff weeks. And so it's not as simple as just picking the best players because you're going to show up in the finals and everybody's going to have those players. What you need to do, or what you can do to try to give yourself an edge, is build in some game stacks. So it's a concept from DFS, but basically you want to have players playing in the same game in case that game is the one that goes off. And now you've got multiple pieces who can have a ceiling outcome, and you've only gotten one thing right in order to get that outcome. And so just looking at this in visual form, this is what it actually takes to get to the end. So weeks 1 through 14, you're weeding out the weak teams. And then for the playoff weeks, you're already going up against other elite teams. And so to increase your chances of sneaking through those playoff weeks, Game Stack can really give you a meaningful edge. And then, of course, when you get to week 17, this is based on the Puppy 3 final size for last year, which was 230, but most of the money is going to be in that top row there. So you really want to do things that can maximize your team's ceiling outcome while reducing the amount of things that you have to get right. And this graphic is from a video that I did breaking down my team that won $100,000 last summer. So if you're brand new to best ball or you haven't seen that video yet, go ahead and check that out. I'll have a link in the description for that. And so last year, Peter Overzet did this video that kind of dominated the discourse around best ball, basically explaining why week 17 is all that matters. And the gist of it is because all of the money is weighted towards week 17 and it's weighted very heavily towards the top finishers. Basically, we want to be maximizing our chances of having a high score in that finals. So if you haven't seen that video yet and you're still curious about why we're game stacking, I definitely recommend checking that out. Some more research this summer that came out further emphasizing the importance of game stacks. This is from Establish the Run's Mike Leone, his Best Ball Manifesto. Also a great read. That's a free article over on their site. But this is showing that basically when you have two quarterbacks on your team, if they're both game stacked, that gives you your lineup the highest expected value. And I think it's important here because, if you're just stacking one of your QBs, or even if you're stacking two of your QBs, it's not going to have the same expected value as if those QBs were game stacked. And that's why I think game stacking can give us an edge because a lot of teams, I think, Leone's research showed, something like 80 or 90% of teams in the field are already doing generic team stacks. So it's basically assumed that if you enter the contest, you're going to be doing team stacks. And if you're not, you're already lighting that money on fire. So just doing a team stack isn't going to increase your odds over the field. You've really got to start adding in those game stacks to increase the chances of your lineup making it to the end and succeeding. So I've been burying the lead, but here is the 2023 Week 17 schedule in bulk. Obviously mentioned it at the top, but the Chiefs-Bengals matchup is all the rage right now. I think it's important to understand here, though, that the goal isn't to necessarily target one or two of these games. The goal is just to get a lineup to Week 17 that has Week 17 game stacks built in. So these games are going to happen 8 months from now. We're pretty bad from year to year at identifying which defenses are going to be elite or not. So I wouldn't worry too much about targeting any individual game. I just try to let the draft come to you and build these stacks into your existing lineup. And I've got a tool that uses all 3 playoff weeks that I'll show in a draft here at the end of the show. So I wanted to show some examples of how this has played out in the past. Obviously, the two most commonly referenced examples are the Best Ball Mania 2 winner, Liam Murphy, had a game stack of Amon-Ra and Rashad Penny. Those two players combined for over 60 points in a game where those two teams combined for over 60 points. And then last year, Best Ball Mania 3, Pat Kerrane, he had several team stacks built into his lineup, including Bucks-Panthers, where DJ Moore and Chris Godwin contributed to his lineup, as well as Tom Brady. And then he also had a Patriots-Dolphins game stack and used points from several of those players as well. Pat's talked about in some of his stuff as well that Tyquan Thornton, who he drafted in the 18th round, was solely because he had Miami players on that team. And he said it was the only team that he took Tyquan Thornton on, and it ended up being part of why he won $2 million. And I think that's another benefit to the game stacking, is it forces you to naturally diversify your portfolio over just falling in love with the same players in the same range of every single draft. I've got a few more examples here. This is from my lineup that won $100,000 last year on the right. The team that beat me in the finals by just over half a point and won $200,000 had a game stack with George Kittle and Devontae Adams combining for 40 points. And you can see, too, from these previous examples that it doesn't necessarily need to be all of the pieces from one game. It certainly helps targeting multiple pieces from one game, because if that game does go off, now you've got multiple guys who could be the one that end up contributing to your game stack. But even these skinnier stacks here, where you've just got one or two players from a game, can end up making a difference. And so I'll walk through the example from my team here. This is my full lineup on the left, but for Week 17 in particular, I had a heavy Bucks team stack. I originally had drafted Christian McCaffrey as part of that stack, but he was traded mid-season, mitigating that. But because I had such a heavy bet on Tampa, I did tack on Laviska Shenault at the end of that draft. So I still had the game stack. But I guess those who are anti-Week 17 game stacking or think it's overblown could point to this and say, well, Laviska didn't contribute to your lineup. It didn't work. The concept is moot. You should have just picked a better player and you could have won $200,000. But I would argue that it played out exactly how we expect it to. And so this is a chart showing Sam Darnold's pass attempts. You can see that in that Week 17 game, his pass attempts nearly doubled. That's going to increase the chances of Laviska scoring more fantasy points. So even though it didn't play out perfectly in this example, it reinforces the concept that we're trying to get at here. So finally, before jumping in a draft, I do want to talk about whether or not we should care about weeks 15 and 16, especially with Best Ball Mania now having a 1 out of 16 advance rate in both of those rounds. It's a little bit harder to even get to week 17. And so I'm using my results from 2022 here, which admittedly is a small sample, but I thought the results were pretty striking. So in reality, I had 36 teams reach the best ball playoffs last year out of about 220 lineups. So I was right in line with an average regular season advance rate. These were spread out across various contests. So these expected outcomes are sort of generalized here because the advanced structure varies, but you can kind of get the concept here. Based on those 36 playoff teams, I would have expected to have 3 semifinals teams. And based on that, my odds of even getting one team to the finals was looking pretty slim heading into the playoffs last year. And then here's what actually happened. I ran incredibly hot in the playoffs, had 9 teams reach the semifinals, which even with those 9 semifinals teams, the odds were stacked against me for getting even one team to the finals, but I ended up getting 5 teams in the finals. So yeah, we could chalk this up to I just got incredibly lucky and ran hot, or there could be something driving this. And so I went back and looked at my finals teams and what happened in week 16 last year to see what happened there. And I found that all 5 of my finals teams used points from a game stack in week 16 to semifinals. So this is showing that there was a lot of Dallas Philly here. So this one had CeeDee Lamb, Devonta Smith. This team, San Francisco, Washington. More San Francisco, Washington. This is the team that went on to win $100,000. You get the idea here. Basically, I had been building for not only week 17, but when the opportunity presented itself, building in week 16 game stacks that still fit with a week 17 game stack as well. And it made a difference. I significantly overperformed my advance rates. So to me, this is really like the skeleton key. There's a lot of other good research out there on the different aspects of drafting. And I think that's all just kind of, to me, is just part of the process. And this is where you set your lineups apart from the rest of the field. So of the semifinals groups I was in, which was a total of 9, I believe, 85% of the advancing teams used points from a game stack in week 16. And for these contests, it was generally a 1 out of 18 advance rate. So pretty similar structure to Best Ball Mania 4 this year. I also looked at my teams that did not advance, and 3 of the 4 that did not advance did not have points from a week 16 game stack contributing to their lineup. And the 1 team of the 4 that did, you can see it here. I finished in 3rd in this group and nearly, or not quite nearly, but was pretty close to advancing. This team had points from a game stack and was still pretty close to advancing despite only getting 7 points from the quarterback position. So these game stacks really can supercharge your lineup during the playoff weeks. And as I mentioned, there are ways that you can do this without jeopardizing ADP value or good roster construction. And that's how you should be building in these drafts. So I'll be entering a draft here in a second, but just a reminder, if you have not followed us or subscribed on Twitter and YouTube, you can do that, and we'll eventually be giving away $25, which can fund a Best Ball Mania entry or 5 puppy drafts, depending on whatever your preference is. So go ahead and give us a follow on those platforms. And with that, we will jump in. Gonna hop into Puppy for this one instead of Best Ball Mania 4. Puppy is almost 60% full at this point, so trying to get my lineups in here, especially now that the schedule is out. And I guess one thing that I didn't touch on is how the schedule impacts Best Ball Mania, because of Best Ball Mania having the regular season prize. Um, I think there is something to be said for targeting teams with easier schedules in the regular season, but really, because we're not great at identifying which teams have the better defenses from year to year, I'm ultimately really only going to focus on it in the extremes. Like, I think Warren Sharp does some really good schedule analysis. Maybe read some of his stuff, and if there's a team that looks like they're really up against it in a certain category or late in the season, maybe factor that into how I'm drafting for Best Ball Mania. If you are even considering targeting the regular season prize, which I still think my preference is ultimately to target the playoff weeks. That's where the bulk of the prizes are, but it's worth keeping in mind. So one thing I've had in these puppy drafts, man, I cannot get in the top half of a round to save my life. My Justin Jefferson exposure has got to be so low right now. And once again, with the 10th pick. So we'll be drafting at the back of this one. And while we wait for this draft to start, I do want to show this team that I drafted last night, because it's a really good example of building in some of these game stacks without putting yourself at a disadvantage. So this is a pretty heavy 0 RB team, which I'll talk through why I don't necessarily like doing that at this time of year during the draft. But we had Justin Fields, Anthony Richardson, Kamara, A-Chain, Algier, Jalen Warren, Chuba, Gainwell, Keontae Ingram. At receiver, Devontae Adams, Amon-Ra, Debo, Michael Pittman, Jahan Dotson, Darnell Mooney, Rondale Moore, and then Pitts and Cole Kmet. So as far as week 17, this team has Atlanta, Chicago, San Francisco, Washington, Las Vegas, Indy, and it's pretty weak, but there's Philly, Arizona in there as well. And one thing you'll notice looking at all these picks is there really isn't a single pick in this entire draft where I reached on a player. So you definitely can build for this if you're being targeted without jeopardizing your team structure or your ADP value. And also note with this team, I have 2 week 16 game stacks built in and 3 week 15 game stacks built in. So pretty good stuff here from a stacking perspective, especially considering it was my first attempt last night after the schedule came out. So we'll see if I can get back to our current draft here. So far, things going pretty much according to plan in this one. Another thing I'll note with that last team that I was showing, obviously I had Justin Fields and Anthony Richardson. I think overall I don't like pairing Anthony Richardson with one of the elite quarterbacks. Despite my love for Anthony Richardson, I think what makes him valuable is the fact that he is kind of a leverage play off of those elite quarterbacks. So when you're taking Anthony Richardson, it should be because you think he's going to perform similarly to those elite quarterbacks. But in terms of that team, obviously it made sense with the Devontae Adams game stack there, Vegas and Indy. So we'll go ahead and grab Devontae Adams here. I would guess, based on the ADPs of where they're going, that Devontae Adams and Jonathan Taylor is going to end up being a pretty popular Week 17 game stack. You've also got Anthony Richardson going near the 7-8 turn, which puts him in the Devontae Adams territory as well. So that's something to try and think through as well, is what pairings are going to be most popularly owned by the field things of that nature. So it's a pairing I don't have much of yet. I've been mixing in Jonathan Taylor, but he's not necessarily someone who's been a must target for me. So that's what we'll do for now, and we'll see where that takes us. I have noticed for sure after doing a lot of these drafts, there are definitely pockets of the draft where I've been targeting certain positions, and I've kind of got to force myself to get out of that. Otherwise, I'm going to end up underexposed to players I don't necessarily want to be. So just for example, round 7 and 8 is a pretty comfy spot for getting wide receiver right now. And there's a pretty big cliff after like round 8 at wide receiver. So to me, that's kind of the last call before you start to get into the rookie dart throws in the latter half of the draft. But as a result of that, I don't really have a lot of guys like Evan Ingram or Darren Waller who are tight ends that I don't necessarily want to have a full fade on. Another spot with this is like rounds 9 and 10 are a really good spot to be adding on running backs, especially the way that I draft, which is usually pretty light on running backs early. But as a result of that, I don't have as much of sort of the third tier of quarterbacks, the pocket passers like Kirk and Tua, the runners like Daniel Jones, other guys like Geno Smith and Jared Goff go in that range. So I've got to do a better job of forcing myself out of kind of my default comfort zone when I'm doing these drafts. Boy, one thing that's really struck me is, if you watched EJ and I did our shows breaking down the rookies, and I'd been saying Anthony Richardson would end up as a 6th round pick, Jahmyr Gibbs would end up as a 3rd round pick. I did not expect that to happen within like a week of us releasing that episode. So Gibbs frequently going at the 3-4 turn now. Richardson has been going around the 7-8 turn, but a lot of times you can see him go mid-7th. And it's really gotten to a point where, I'm perfectly happy mixing those guys into my lineup still, but I don't think they're anymore. They're not necessarily heavy targets for me anymore. So looking through what we've got in the draft so far, nothing too crazy stands out. We've got the chalk Chiefs Philly stacks. Nothing too crazy there yet. It does really feel, and this is why I've been so frustrated with how many late first round picks I've been getting in these drafts. It really feels like things drop off after you get through the Ramondre, Josh Jacobs, DK Metcalf tier. So looking at who's on the board now, I guess Brees is a guy we still like, but then things to me really flatten out. I mean, Debo is certainly a guy who can give you spike weeks, so I've been taking him quite a bit in this range, but like ETN I think should fall a little bit. So in a lot of cases I've been targeting the Lamar and the Justin Fields in this range, if not just punting and starting to tap into the next tier of wide receivers. So with our build here, we've got our elite running back. I don't typically see Brees fall quite this far, so he's a guy that would be interesting to me at this point, and he goes off the board. Fields is certainly interesting at this point. That might be the route that we go, but again, I do have the Anthony Richardson stack potential here to go with Devontae Adams, but I don't necessarily like building around Anthony Richardson just because you can get in some draft rooms that are pretty frothy for him. So we'll go ahead and go with Justin Fields, and maybe we'll get DJ Moore on the bring back, start building up the Chicago stack here. And boy, just looking at the pockets of the draft in terms of ADP, you can see why this team is shaping up pretty similar to the one I drafted last night from a stacking perspective, because you can get your Vegas Indy right at the 1-2 turn, and then you can come back around and pair Kyle Pitts with your Bears stack from rounds 3, 4, and 5. So, that's something I've already fallen into in 2 drafts now. Might be time to assume that that's going to be a pretty common pairing for the folks who are drafting for week 17. And Spike Week has projections for player ownership, not just like general player ownership, but like ownership of certain stacks. And I'm not a Spike Week subscriber just because I'm too stingy to pay for the monthly subscription there. But it really struck me. I saw some commentary last night about their stuff, and basically saying that the pairing of Justin Fields and DJ Moore is only projected to be 6% owned by the field. And personally, I'm not sure that I buy that. I think it's a pretty easy pairing for a lot of people to get right there at the 3-4 turn. I think in a lot of ways, DJ Moore's ADP is being propped up because he's being paired with people to Fields right there. So that struck me as one that seemed a little weird. But at the very least, it made me want to go build some more Fields DJ Moore stacks in case it is less owned than I expect. Another thing I'll mention, just from a roster construction perspective, generally I like doing 0 RB builds. I'm definitely more of a wide receiver heavy, or trying to get those elite quarterback and tight ends so that I can only draft 2 at those positions. But doing 0 RB at this time of year is pretty tough. You've got to be really targeted in the types of players you're taking, because we don't have clarity on these team depth charts, whereas we will have that in August. So I think for the most part right now, I've been trying to get a lot of my running backs, taking at least one early, trying to take another 1 or 2 in the 9th through 10th. And then kind of the last call for me has been rounds 13 and 14, unless you're really getting down into dart throw territory. Sometimes if you're lucky, a guy like Chuba Hubbard falls into that range, which I don't like Chuba. I don't think he's good, but I do think he's clearly the backup in Carolina, which has some value. So a couple things that stand out at the turn here. We've got somebody got the premium Burrow double stack, which looks nice. We've also got somebody doing a bully tight end build with 2 early tight ends, and then a double early QB build there with an unstacked Josh Allen and then a stacked Justin Herbert. So those generally aren't builds I'm mixing in. I'm pretty much, if I take a quarterback early, I'm assuming that he's going to be the guy contributing to my lineup all the time, so I don't really want to take a second one. So as I mentioned, for the Atlanta stuff here, and just in general, I like having an elite tight end. So tight end more than quarterback, I think you can get away with building 3, but when I can, when it makes sense for my team, I like to go the elite route. And you can certainly argue whether Kyle Pitts should be considered elite or not, but a guy with his athleticism and talent profile, I'm debating, whether I should risk it and take like a Jackson Smith and Jigba here, or just get the Kyle Pitts and move on. And I think I'm going to go the Kyle Pitts route here. We do have the person here at the 12th spot without a tight end. So we've already got, you can see, as I check the boxes off on this spreadsheet here on the left, it'll kind of light up And it helps me identify, not only which teams will help me for week 17, but okay, can I tack on a guy who will help me in both week 16 and week 17, that kind of thing. So kind of a gross spot here. Feels like a tier break at wide receiver. I don't really love Miles Sanders or Joe Mixon here. We'll go ahead and grab Tyler Lockett. He's a guy who I was initially kind of worried about him with the JSN pick, but Lockett's one of those guys that we always underestimate, and he always overperforms. And I wish I had the tweet saved, but I saw some numbers in terms of spike weeks, and he actually has performed better than DK Metcalf in terms of putting up like truly elite top 5 weeks at the wide receiver position. So, I'm a little cautious about Tyler Lockett, and I have a hard time with Miles Sanders. He kind of feels like a dead zone running back pick to me. Obviously, there has been some quotes from the coaching staff out of Carolina saying they want to use him as a 3-down back, get him a lot of receptions, but his yards per route run profile has not been that impressive. He's never dominated a 3-down workload, which maybe that's just because he was in Philly and they don't necessarily use a workhorse. But to me, he just feels like a guy where we're making a bet on volume more so than team situation or talent. And those aren't necessarily the bets that I personally want to be making at running back. Looking at the board here, should be a pretty good spot to get wide receivers here. Already in good shape at quarterback and tight end. If he's on the board, I think I'm going to pass on Anthony Richardson this time. Already built that team I showed at the top where I've got the Fields, Richardson, Devontae Adams, Kyle Pitts. So I don't want to completely duplicate myself here. So we'll see what we can work in here. Deontay Johnson is a guy who could, for one, he builds a week 17 stack with Seattle, as well as week 15 with Indy and Jonathan Taylor. But also he's a guy who, to me, is a little bit mispriced. We've touched on his lack of touchdowns last year and how basically from year to year he's shown he's a consistent target earner. And I think that is what is sticky from year to year. The touchdowns can come and go. Kenny Pickett could take a step forward. So Deontay Johnson's a guy who I've already been targeting ahead of some of the wide receivers around him. Although in a vacuum, I'm not sure if I would take Deontay Johnson versus, in this case, we've got Jordan Addison sliding. If he falls all the way to me, that would be 10 picks past ADP. So I may end up going Addison if he's there and hope that Deontay Johnson gets around the turn back to me. So Addison goes, and that's not the end of the world. I will say the Dallas guys have been in free fall. There's been several times where I've been in like the 110s of a draft, and Dak is still sitting there. And I've generally been out on Dallas, but I think that's a little bit too far of a fall. So I'm probably going to look to start mixing in more Dallas builds. So unfortunately, Deontay Johnson went off the board. So we're kind of up against the wall here. I've not been taking a lot of Cam Akers, so maybe I just scoop the value on that. I've also been taking a lot of Dotson and Quentin Johnston, so I think I am going to go wide receiver here just because I did make detours to the elite quarterback and tight end, and we are fast approaching the wide receiver cliff. So we'll grab Dotson here first, and there goes Quentin Johnston off the board. So I don't love Zay Flowers. I think he's a fairly similar bet to Rashad Bateman, and you can get Rashad Bateman around later. I don't know, maybe we will end up taking our guy, Anthony Richardson, here, just because I'm not seeing a whole lot else that I like here. All right, basically deciding between Richardson or Akers or Montgomery. I think just in terms of ADP value, I'd side with Akers over Montgomery. All right, we'll take what the draft room gives me. Anthony Richardson, 3 picks past ADP. And now we've got a full Week 17 game stack with Vegas and Indy and Chicago and Atlanta. So feeling pretty good about this lineup, but I am going to have some work to do at wide receiver. Probably looking at 8 or 9 wide receivers on this team. We're done at quarterback, and then either 5 or 6 running backs and 2 tight ends. So obviously, Cole Kmet could make a lot of sense for this team if we want to go that route, but could mix it up. With the rushing quarterbacks in particular, I don't feel as strongly about doing, double or triple stacks. I think you can single stack it and be fine with those guys. Looking at our sheet here on the side as far as potential stack options right now for Week 17, we've got Pittsburgh and San Francisco as stacks that we could build around. So just looking at my team build, there's not a lot of great Pittsburgh wide receivers left, and Freiermuth, while I don't think he's a bad pairing with Kyle Pitts necessarily, I think just given where I'm at wide receiver, I've got more work to do at wide receiver before taking a guy like Freiermuth. But San Francisco could mix in a guy like Elijah Mitchell. He'd be a nice pick given my running back room. Also got a guy like Jaylen Warren, who I love taking in the around pick 160. So those are some of the stacking thoughts there right now. Otherwise, not a lot of teams showing up that can be a stack option for multiple weeks. So, and that's the other thing too, like you don't have to force a lot of this. Just naturally over the course of a draft, you're going to end up falling into some of these stacks. But we saw it with my lineup that made it to the puppy finals last year. It's not only is it hard to get there, it's hard to land on the right game stack. And so that's why I'm so intentional about mixing in as many of these game stacks as possible. So we'll flip back to the board here. See what we got. Madison is a player who I've been taking a lot of recently. It had been kind of quiet on the Dalvin Cook front for a while, and then we just got another report yesterday saying he is probably on his way out of Minnesota. So I'm again trying to get my Madison exposure before he shoots up to, if Dalvin Cook is out of town, we're probably taking Madison around Miles Sanders at worst. So unfortunately for my team, we've hit the wide receiver cliff. Typically, Sutton, Bateman, and Elijah Moore are some of the last players that I like taking. So we're going to have to get creative here. We can take Jacoby Myers, increase our bet on the Vegas game. It's a little bit ahead of ADP here, but just given where my wide receiver room is at, I don't think it's an egregious reach. I don't think I've drafted Odell or Juju once. If I'm taking New England players, I'd rather wait until the very end to take them. But we do have Charbonnet or Brian Robinson here as players who, I've already got wide receivers from those teams, so I can increase my bet on those teams. So I'll take Charbonnet here. I think the Seattle offense is going to be really good. Whether or not Charbonnet gets enough opportunity to be relevant, I don't know. But, especially in a build like this where I'm going to be taking swings at running back, trying to hit on a late guy who can give me some upside in the playoffs, I think, Charbonnet is a perfectly fine pick here. I've been taking both Brian Robinson and Antonio Gibson. The nice thing about Gibson is he's going almost 2 rounds later, but they both feel like picks who are discounted solely because drafters don't know which one to take there. So we've got Jacoby Myers added to our Las Vegas bet here, and feel like I'm in pretty good shape now across the board. I could consider a guy like Cole Kmet with my next set of picks. That falls into place nicely. Could also wait and keep building up the Vegas bet and try to get Michael Mayer late. So a couple options that I'm keeping in the back of my mind there at tight end. Boy, once again, Geno. I've done it quarterback before. I give myself a chance to take Geno. He's a guy who I'd be perfectly fine taking him in anywhere in round 9, even late round 8, maybe. And I just don't have enough of him on my teams yet, so I need to be more intentional about targeting Geno from the get-go. Just looking across the board here, seeing if anything anybody else is doing stands out as far as if folks are sneaking in any Week 17 stuff. Looks like the person drafting next to me here in the 11th spot, they have a little bit of a Dallas-Detroit thing going, although just based on their ADPs, that also could just be the way the board fell there. One thing that has stood out to me over the last couple of weeks of drafts is CJ Stroud has started to fall quite a bit in drafts. When me and EJ did our rookie show, there was maybe a 1-round gap between those two players, Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, that is. Now, there's been draft rooms that have been in where Stroud doesn't go until the 17th round, which is absolutely crazy to me. I get that it's a rookie quarterback in an offense that we don't think is going to be good, but I feel very confident that Stroud's going to be starting during the playoff weeks, if not the whole season, whereas some of the other quarterbacks going in that round 17 range are guys like Mac Jones, Desmond Ridder, Sam Howell, who, maybe Mac Jones has more job security than those other two, but those other two definitely don't feel like they have good enough job security that we should be making bets on them at this point in the offseason. So to me, lately, Houston and to a lesser extent, New England have kind of become my break glass stacks. Essentially, if I get sniped on everything else, you can tack on Nico Collins in the 13th, and then sometimes you can wait all the way until the 17th to get CJ Stroud. And there's plenty of other pass catchers from Houston that go in the 18th round. So I think that's a misprice to me. I'm fine if you want to be out on CJ Stroud, but I don't think there should be a 3-round gap between him and Bryce Young. But I am done at quarterback in this draft, so don't have to worry about it. I mentioned earlier that Eli Mitchell was shaping up to be a nice pick. Give me some week 17 correlation with Jahan Dotson here. And it also just fits the build that I'm doing. This is typically a spot where I'd be taking a running back anyway. Jonathan Mingo is a guy who's been rising up the boards lately. So he's a guy I might consider with my pick in the 12th round, or grab Alec Pierce, who I think of the Indy wide receivers, Alec Pierce's play style fits best with Anthony Richardson, who can throw it deep. But I've had my man, that hurts. Eli Mitchell goes off the board. So can grab Roshan and increase our bet on the Bears. All right, we'll grab Mingo for fun here. Probably grab Pierce just to give myself a stack partner for Anthony Richardson. I know I've got Jonathan Taylor on this team, but I typically like to have at least one pass catcher with my quarterbacks. So a little bit of a reach on Pierce, but it fits the build, and now I feel much better about the wide receiver room at this point. And given that I passed on a pretty good pocket of running backs, probably going to lean towards doing a 2-6-8-2 build here, 6 running backs, 8 wide receivers, unless the draft board presents something obvious that would tip me towards going 2-5-9-2. So just scrolling down a bit, looking at the next pocket of running backs, one thing that doesn't make a lot of sense to me is the gap between Mostert and Jeff Wilson. Jeff Wilson going at the 170, Raheem Mostert at 154. So almost a 2-round gap between those two players who profile pretty similarly to me. I mean, it just seemed like this kind of a hot hand thing with the two of them. Obviously, Devon Achane is there now, and there are some rumors about Dalvin Cook ending up there. So I've not gone crazy drafting Jeff Wilson, but I've certainly been scooping him up when he's there, 2-3 rounds later than Mostert. We've also got Tyler Algier if we want to add to our bet on that Chicago-Atlanta game. Obviously, big Bijan fan here. I don't know anybody who isn't, but when we don't have Bijan on our team, that's already kind of a small bet against Bijan. Obviously, the draft board felt that it wasn't an option, but you know, Algier is basically a leverage play on the Bijan teams, and fits the game stack, fits the team build. So I don't mind taking him. I wish he would fall a little bit more, and maybe he will if the hype on Bijan keeps increasing. But he actually goes ahead of ADP in this draft, around 145. But again, just kind of getting back to the next tier of running backs that I'm going to be looking at with my next pick. Obviously, Donta Foreman, can add him as a Chicago bet. I already mentioned Jaylen Warren as a Pittsburgh guy for some playoff stuff. Singletary is a guy I have not really been taking a lot of, although you can make the case that like a Miles or like a Chuba Hubbard, you at least know that he's the number 2 for that team. The problem is we just don't think that team is going to be particularly good. I talked about Chase Brown on our rookie show. He's a guy too who I haven't stopped taking, but I've backed off a little bit just because there's enough ambiguity in that Cincinnati RB2 spot right now. We've seen Chris Evans get a little bit of hype from the coaching staff. We've seen Travion Williams get a little bit of love from the coaching staff. I still would take Chase Brown as my pick to be the guy there, but there's enough uncertainty that, I don't love it at this point. I'd rather wait until August when we know who's going to be the guy there. Unfortunately, we had Jaylen Warren come off the board at pick 150, but Roschon is not someone I've taken much of. Still feels like all 3 of those backs could end up being the one there. Of course, the concern is that with Fields rushing, how much are you really going to get near the goal line? But yeah, it fits my team bet on Chicago. We get them almost 15 picks past ADP. I like that pick a lot. Gotta do some thinking at tight end because we missed on Cole Kmet when we went double wide receiver at the last round. So still have Michael Mayer out there as a stack option that I like, or can just punt it and wait until late in the draft. Not seeing anything super obvious as far as playoff correlation. Well, I just talked about not loving Singletary, but like I said, we know he's the RB2 for that team, whereas a guy like Chase Brown or even Donta Foreman, we don't know that. So we'll add him in here. It is interesting with Houston and Tennessee. They play in weeks 15 and 17, so they're an easy team to get, and you right off the bat get 2 weeks of playoff correlation there. Unfortunately, I think both of those offenses are going to be pretty terrible. So it's not particularly fun, but guys like Henry, obviously. Henry's not a guy I've taken much of at this point. And it's not even that I'm necessarily opposed to Henry. I just think he's going right in that pocket of guys like Nick Chubb, Ramondre, Josh Jacobs, Tony Pollard, Brees. Like, I'm pretty much taking all of those guys over Derrick Henry, just given that he's past the usage cliff, he's past the age cliff, and then you factor in that it's probably going to be a bad offense. Like, it is scary having a full fade on him because he gets Houston twice in the playoffs and he can break a slate, but you're also betting on Derrick Henry being healthy 8 months from now. Let's see. This draft hasn't. I haven't really had anything stand out to me in this draft as being too crazy or egregious. Um, for the most part, it seems like people are drafting with pretty good structure. We do have this person in the 4 spot. They've taken 4 quarterbacks, which is a no-no. And it looks like, at least with Watson, they took him ahead of ADP. So, which I don't necessarily hate because you do get Watson and Chubb, which is a unique pairing based on where they go in drafts. But yeah, at that point, I would only take one of Kyler or Bryce Young, and for all we know, they could be auto drafting. But that's just one team that stood out to me. They're sitting at 4-4-4-2. Their wide receiver room is going to be pretty far behind the 8 ball in this group. Oh, man. So it was probably a stretch to think he would fall all the way to almost pick 180, but Michael Mayer came off the board. So we're pretty much in dart throw territory at this point at tight end. We can dream maybe Sam Laporta falls. Marvin Mims would have been a player I considered from if we were trying to go wide receiver here. We're done at quarterback though, so we'll take them off the list. Tajay is someone who I feel like I've drafted too much of at this point. Obviously, we're still early in the summer, but I checked my exposures and it was too high on him for me to be comfortable there. But I need running backs at this point, and that's the only downside with this sheet is it doesn't necessarily tell me what positions I have for those stacks. So Hayden Winks has done a lot of good work showing which positions from which teams correlate with each other. So like opposing wide receiver 1 versus opposing tight end, things like that. And, in this case, it looks like I have a chance to really build a Tennessee Houston bet here, but I only have Devin Singletary. So that's not necessarily one where like I have to draft Tajay Spears to get the correlation, because it's really not that strong of a correlation between those two. So this is actually an interesting spot. I've got a lot of interesting ways I could go here. Obviously, I like my guy Sam Laporta, but we've also got Taysom Hill almost 15 spots past ADP, or Jeff Wilson, who I was talking about earlier, about 10 spots past ADP. So we're gonna take Jeff Wilson here. That'll get us to our 5 running backs, and we'll see if one of these tight ends makes it back around. I hadn't quite made a decision between which one of those 2 I would take. I do like Laporta, and I'm skeptical of Taysom Hill's usage, but he did have a few 30-point weeks throughout the season last year. And, if one of those had come during the playoff weeks, we'd all be talking about Taysom Hill very differently. Now, obviously, they went out and added Derek Carr, so maybe he gets less usage out there They also added, a rookie running back in Kendry Miller, and they signed Jamal Williams. So they've retooled the running back room and the quarterback room. So maybe we get less of the Taysom Hill sort of gadgety stuff that can break open a slate. But he goes one pick here. Ultimately, Taysom isn't a guy I've taken a lot of, but almost 20 picks past ADP, I'd be more than happy to take him here. But we are going to get our guy, Sam Laporta. This feels like a nice consolation after missing out on Michael Mayer and getting Laporta almost 10 spots past ADP, which I feel like never happens at this point. So our team right now, we're sitting at a 2-5-7-2 with Justin Fields and Anthony Richardson. At running back, we've got Jonathan Taylor, Zach Charbonnet, Roschon Johnson, Jeff Wilson, and Devin Singletary. Wide receiver is Devontae Adams, DJ Moore, Tyler Lockett, Jahan Dotson, Jacoby Myers, Jonathan Mingo, Alec Pierce. And then at tight end, we've got Kyle Pitts and Sam Laporta. So at this point, we're looking for most likely one more running back and one more wide receiver. Would certainly appreciate if this room let Chuba get back, but just based on his ADP, that would be a pretty steep fall there. Unfortunately, the Tennessee passing offense is pretty terrible. I don't really want any of those guys outside of Treylon Burks. Could maybe consider Kyle Phillips with a 18th round dart throw here, but again, I really don't have a strong bet on Houston on this roster, so that's not one I'm really looking to add. Other options, we've got some Dallas stuff here, but I don't really love any of the late round options on Dallas. We don't have any clarity on the RB2 situation there, and I think there's still a chance that they bring back Zeke, which doesn't scare me for Pollard, but it does scare me for taking like a Malik Davis or a Deuce Vaughn right now in drafts. So there goes Chuba at pick 190. Not a huge surprise that he came off the board there. All right, so if we've not seen anything jumping out as super obvious as far as stacks to mix in at this point, so just going to look through some of the options here and see who makes sense just from an upside perspective. Keontae Ingram is a guy I've been drafting more of lately. We do have James Conner getting pretty old at this point. Michael Wilson, also another Arizona guy who I haven't drafted yet, but I want to start adding him to more lineups. He's a nice 18th round dart throw. He got a lot of good glowing reports out of the Senior Bowl. I believe he was a 3rd or 4th round pick, which those don't have great hit rates by any means, but I think he's a worthy flyer at this point, especially if you're playing in a contest like the Puppy where he's not being drafted all that much. So at running back right now, Jerome Ford is one who stands out to me. It is a little bit dicey in terms of situation just because they could re-sign Kareem Hunt or another running back that's out there, but as it stands right now, he's the number 2. Also have Gus Edwards, but it feels like the Ravens are perfectly content to go sign guys off the street if someone like J.K. Dobbins gets hurt. So I've not drafted Gus Edwards very much. I probably should take more of him, but so we'll probably go Jerome Ford here to wrap up our running back room. It also technically mixes in some correlation to Chicago and Houston. So we'll do Jerome Ford, and then the Jets actually show up for Miami, Washington, and Cleveland. But again, at running back, the Miami and Cleveland players that we have are our backup running backs. So I don't feel the need to force a Jets wide receiver, which would basically be Corey Davis at this point. I do have Allen Robinson here if we wanted to take him for Week 17 purposes against Seattle. That doesn't feel good, though. I'm not a believer in late career Allen Robinson at this point. Unfortunately, the board gets pretty barren at that point. Michael Wilson, the guy I mentioned, gives some Week 16 correlation with Chicago, but I don't necessarily want to target him solely for that. I guess we've got some youth with guys like Mingo and Alec Pierce, so I'll go ahead and take Robinson on this team, but not something I'm going to be doing very often. So again, final read through for this team: Fields and A-Rich, Jonathan Taylor, Charbonnet, Roschon, Singletary, Jeff Wilson, Jerome Ford. A pretty good hero RB room, if I say so myself. And we got almost over a round of ADP value on Roschon, and got almost 10 picks of ADP value on Jeff Wilson, so that feels nice. At wide receiver, we had Devontae Adams, DJ Moore, Tyler Lockett, Dodson, Jacoby Myers, Mingo, Pierce, and Allen Robinson. Got a little bit behind the 8 ball at wide receiver, I think, but recovered pretty nicely with Mingo and Pierce there in the mid to late rounds. And then at tight end, Kyle Pitts and Sam Laporta. So, as far as tight end rooms go, I think that's got plenty of upside. As far as playoff stacks, we have bets on Chicago, Atlanta, and Vegas and Indy for Week 17, as well as a weaker Seattle and Pittsburgh correlation. So I feel good about that. Also have some Week 16 and Week 15 bets sprinkled in there. So overall, pretty happy with this team. Hopefully you found some of the playoff stuff we talked through today useful, and seeing it in practice in a draft, how I use it as far as, still focusing on construction and value first and foremost, but then focusing on the correlation and targeting players that can add correlation through multiple weeks of the playoffs. I really think this was a key part of why I had such a high advance rate over expectation last year. So we'll certainly be doing more drafts in the coming weeks. Obviously, the puppy is getting pretty close to being full. So for The Climb, I am Alex. Remember to give us a follow on Twitter or subscribe here on YouTube to be entered into our giveaway. And thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if you have any favorite matchups or teams that you're targeting based on the playoff week schedule. And I'll see you next time.